today. Welcome to the Core Connectivity webinar on reconciling COVID-19 with God's divine plan for you and your family. My name is Joanna Julian. I am a parenting and family life coach at Core Connectivity. And I created this presentation to share some of the biblical insights that I have learned over 35 years of parenthood, but also that are very relevant for this season of pandemic that we're experiencing together. And so I want to start with a quick breathing exercise and an opening prayer so that we can calm our brains and prepare our minds to be in a more empowered state of learning. So I'm going to ask you to just breathe in for a count of 4, hold it for a count of 4, and release for a count of 4. We'll do it twice. So on my count, breathe in, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold 4, 3, 2, 1. Exhale 4, 3, 2, 1. And one more time, breathe in. 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold 4, 3, 2, 1. Exhale 4, 3, 2, 1. And thank you. So this opening prayer, I think, really sets the stage for the state of heart and mind that we need to be in for this topic. And it's from my favorite author, Saint Teresa of Avila. Let nothing upset you. Let nothing startle you. All things pass. God does not change. Patience wins all it seeks. Whoever has God lacks nothing. God alone is enough. So, the insights that I'm about to share with you today are the result of my own sort of parenthood journey as a reformed mom of 2 grown sons who are today 35 and 29 years old. In 2004, when mobile connectivity landed in the hands of youth, that's when the alarms went off for me. I was working in technology, and I really believed that we were going to be in a world of hurt at home. And I wanted to understand, what does it mean to grow up with a device in the hands of youth? And then also, what are the new demands on parents? And honestly, I was anxious and I was mad at God for allowing the situation. I felt like I had all of the responsibility and none of the power to keep my kids secure and to raise them well. And I also didn't really trust God's divine plan associated with free will and the consequences of human error and evil in the world. I believe that I had this expectation that I should be in charge of my kids' life and that I should be the one who's in control since they were given to me to raise. But since then, I have been recovering, or actually more accurately restoring my faith in God as a deeply intimate personal relationship with Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, who is the Son of God and who is God in the flesh for me. Now, for me, this has been a very real and practical relationship that is founded on my own desire to understand the human condition and to provide instruction on how we're vulnerable to fear. We're also at the same time resilient by faith. And so while I consider myself to be a mom, an American mom with a heart for Jesus Christ, I know that I cannot manipulate and manage the faith of my family. I can only make it look good. And so my promise to my husband and my children and their wives and our grandchildren is that I will never stop learning how to become a better version of myself, and that every day I seek the wisdom to reflect back truth and love to my family in response to what's happening in our lives as individuals and collectively as a family. So that's about me. That's the backdrop, so you know where I'm coming from. And and truly, you know, hindsight is 2020. And when I look back on the last 15 years, it's all been about control and empowerment lessons. You know, we had life disrupted with the device. And at that point, you know, it was, you know, disturbing. And then we have life interrupted now with the pandemic. So, this is a different type of power crisis. When I was looking back at it from the standpoint of devices landing in the hands of youth, I was in pursuit of a simple question, which was, what is God's divine plan, allowing these devices in the hands of kids who don't know any better? And then the deeper question was, did I agree with God's decision to give free will to my kids? And then the devices landed in the hands of kids as well. So my question was, deep down inside, was I in agreement with God, or was I at odds with God? And that my child had the same, he was equal to me in terms of intelligent life and free will. That was something that I had to really ponder and question. Did I agree with that? But today, on top of that, we're talking about a different type of power crisis. And it highlights how human nature, we focus on, even though we're all experiencing the same waves of emotion and grief and loss, we perceive our situations as different and we judge it. And so it's hard to be in it together. It's hard to help each other and collaborate when we're perceiving and judging as people being different. So for example, even though we have the same sense of grief and loss, the human tendency is to minimize someone else's suffering because we think ours is greater, or to minimize our own suffering because we think someone else's is greater. So an example of that is high school students today. They have tremendous loss of not having a graduation event, or wondering what's going to happen for college next year, not even being able to finish the works that they started to get into college. And all of the other events that go along with that. So they have a real grief that they need to experience, but then when they compare that with death, who am I to feel that way? So we deny our feelings, and we all know that that's not good for our health. And so that's kind of an internal struggle that people are dealing with. And then another example is some people have lost their incomes, and they may perceive that that is worse than anything else. And then self-pity steps in. And then that makes us even more powerless. So the bigger question in all of these, whether it's life disrupted or life interrupted, is how do you perceive the role of God amid these power crises? And how it will help us in responding to the ways in which we and our kids are impacted. And so the big question is, are we in this together? And this is my thesis, is that God's divine plan in this pandemic and in every life challenge is to educate us and our children how to respond to adversity with thought leadership that's informed by faith, not by fear. And the science bears this out, as I'll explain. But these are seasons of crisis that are deep lessons about control and empowerment, the difference. And they're intended to bless us, not to harm us. And so this is how I understand the essence of resilience in an imperfect world. And it's based on my study of the human condition in prevention strategy work for youth substance prevention over the past 15 years, and also my passion to restore power, the power balance in the parent-child bond. It's been my passion. So our goal today, my goal for you, my prayer for you, is that even if you're considering it now, you will go deeper into the knowledge and find more strength to consider how to, in your own mind, perceive faith as God's promises to empower you and your children to overcome adversity. And some examples of God's promises equals your power that make up the pillars in the heart of my mind for my family that I've created in my inner world that reflect back how I want to respond to what's happening in the world. Are these scriptural references. And they start with the core promises that really resonated for me when I was looking at how to deal with the power crisis of mobile connectivity and all of the adult issues that kids were working with. And then also how that power is used to overcome adversity. So the first one, Jeremiah 31, verse 16 to 17, really speaks to my heart because it says, do not cry, do not weep. The children return home to their own border, heart and mind, head to heart, heart to mind, heart to head, when we are faithful to God. Children come back to their own border. They come back from the land of the enemy when we are faithful. Well, what does that faithfulness mean? It means that we honor the character of God, and by grace, the children come home, not by our own controlling efforts. And in this way, I see God has given us generations to learn how to love one another as God loves humanity. Well, how does God love humanity? With a character that is trustworthy. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4 to 8. Love is patient, love is kind, love forbears all things. Love never fails, right? And then love also casts out fear. 1 John 4:18. There is no fear in love. It's not possible to have both. And this is really good news. And God grants wisdom generously to those who lack it and seek it. And it's the wisdom to know the difference between what is fear and what is love. And so with these empowering thoughts that continue to nourish us internally, it is possible to not let the circumstances of the world define you, and to renew your mind and to grow strong spiritually and build up your resilience in the boundary of your relationships with your children and your family, to prove that God's trustworthy character is good. That is his goodwill for us. And to be an overcomer, to let this mind which was also in Christ Jesus to be in you. And the way I understand that is to hold every thought captive and obedient to Christ, who went and brings us to the mind of God. When we are reminded of what the thoughts that God have towards us, then we can grow in strength and build our resilience that comes from within. So with that, that's just an example of some of the scriptures that inform how I respond and build up my own resilience in my relationships with my family. But when we look at the pandemic, why are we all in this together? I mean, why does it happen together? Why should we be in this together? Because it's an opportunity to learn something about love, who is God, in the boundary of all of our relationships, despite what's happening in the world. So for today, I'm just going to cover some of the stumbling blocks that prevent parents from communicating truth and love to their children, introduce the relational model of authority to restore parent-child confidence in uncertain times, and then we'll discuss I'll share with you some of the tools to build a family culture that instills discipline and fosters resilience. Now, the stumbling blocks really all center around anxiety and the stress response to world events. Like I said, the consequences of human error and evil in the world that does happen. So we and our children, before the pandemic, we were already swimming in a sea of anxiety and fear as social media and cyber technology just brings the world in closer and intensifies the emotion of some of the adult issues, which are anxiety, bullying, addiction, and sexual exploitation. And in the pandemic environment, and now it's easy to really feel out of control as everybody's asked, everybody, I don't care what your age are, what your generation, what creed you are, or where you are in the world, you're asked to do more than you ever thought you could ever be expected to do. And it sometimes feels really hopeless. So let's look at, from a scientific standpoint, my friend Zeli Triantafilou, she does magnificent work. She's a toxicologist, and she has a company called MindZen, and she does stress resilience training for professionals and also private folks. And I love this image she allows me to use because it's a very simple image of how there are two forces at work that are in our flesh that mingle with our spirit, that our spirit mingles with it. They're all interconnected, but these are the two forces at work. There's the sympathetic nervous system that's illustrated by the amygdala on the very right side, the pink area that's pointing away. That is the response, the survival instinct, the threat response, fight, flight, or fright. So that is meant for our survival, right? So that's associated with the sympathetic nervous system. There's biochemical reactions that are happening, and that part of the brain is getting stronger as it's reacting. The prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for executive function, to reason what is really a threat, to problem solve, right? To assess risks and all of that. That is something that is built up over time through life experiences. That's the learning part. That is empowerment through learning. Whereas the amygdala, we don't, and there's choice involved in that, in what to learn and how to learn from life experiences. But the main point of this is to show that the default isn't something we control. So we don't get to say, well, I don't want to be afraid of that. It happens. And so anxiety, is meant to be a tool. It's meant to be a motivator to get us to move towards something good or away from something bad. But when we are experiencing high levels of anxiety and the stress response, the sympathetic nervous system is activating, it can flood our system and take the prefrontal cortex offline. And so that's the default we want to avoid. So in the talk, you'll hear me referring to default and empowerment, because the default is a desire to be in control. Empowerment is releasing the desire to be in control of things outside and to focus on what you can control internally. Now, in the default mode, this is what the parent mind looks like. And I can describe it because I lived it, and that was my strategy for a long time. And it wasn't until the power crisis with the devices where I really had to take an honest look at myself and say, well, this is silly, because I have no control. I never did. I thought I did, but I never did. Maybe because my kids were compliant didn't mean I had control. It meant they were in charge of themselves, choosing to comply. So it was a very big mind shift for me. But the way I explain it is worrying is not the same thing as caring. It is negative goal setting. And what it does is in this default mode, it sends the signal head to heart and heart to head. So the way the child is going to interpret it as not safe, not okay. I don't want to disturb my parents. And if I have bad news, or if I have something that's risky or unpleasant to share, I don't want to experience their reaction, their negative reaction. And so secrets wind up getting kept. Risky secrets wind up getting kept. And similarly with punishing, and we punish and we call it discipline. Discipline is teaching kids how to take responsibility for their own thoughts and actions and to live with the consequences of them. And so we have consequences in the home to give them that feeling of learning about a positive or a negative consequence associated with their choices of what to do and how to do it in living their daily life. But when we administer, and there are natural consequences, which is a whole nother matter in terms of the fallout that happens. Some of them some of them they can't help, and some of them they could learn, but some have to just be tolerated. But that's a whole nother conversation. Either way, there are consequences. But when we enforce consequences with anger in our heart, head to heart, heart to head, the message the child gets is that they're outcast, because the consequences can be punishing. But what's really punishing and what causes kids to feel like the crime was to get caught is when we are angry and we are enforcing consequences with anger in our heart, because that sense of belonging is lost. And so then the crime, there's no learning. That's not the right lesson. And then your opinion is not the same thing as wisdom. This is such an important distinction. It's probably the most important lesson of this whole presentation, is distinguishing between our opinions and wisdom. Our opinions tend to carry more of the default thinking in it. They have kernels of belief that we know more than we do. It's always limited human understanding of a person or a situation at a given time. No matter how much life experience we have, we can work wisdom into our opinions, but it will always be limited understanding. And we insist often that our opinion is the only understanding in the room. Because our children are younger or they don't have as much life experience, we tend to minimize their value. Whereas wisdom unlocks the pool of meaning in the boundary of a relationship, in family relations especially, to say that there's other input that matters too, and we can learn from each other. Because our children have much to teach us about how their childhoods are informing them. And we have to be open to that so that we can collaborate and invite the Spirit of the Lord to show us how to know and do better and to be more creative in problem solving, but also to withstand negative consequences of things that have happened and to give us hope for a better future and to learn from it and grow from it. See if I can get this to move. So that's the default of the parent. And then the child's default is to also have a closed spirit. Regardless of how good or not good of a parent we are, put that separate. You know, we can be operating in default and not default mode, but the child on their own is going to have their own set of defaults that cause them to believe that they are not worthy of love, that it's not safe to share their greatest fears. And oftentimes because kids are exposed to a very intense culture that's very competitive, that's very performance driven, and they're often getting signals that say, you're not enough unless you send a nude photo of yourself to a love interest. You're not okay unless you medicate with drugs and alcohol to fit in. It's easy for kids to perceive that they are just simply alone, because the isolation and the default mode moves us away from empowerment, away from connection, away from feeling a secure attachment in a community or with another person. And so oftentimes kids can feel, even though we haven't sent any direct signals that we don't care about them, we only care about what they've accomplished or how they make us look. And the feeling of isolation can happen. And so again, this is where secrets can get kept, risky secrets can get kept, and it makes it also very difficult to rally and collaborate and build resilience in response to some of the challenges of the consequences of the pandemic. I wanted to also back up. So that's the default mode. We want to be able to recognize that our default mode is something that's natural. It happens. And what I've learned about the human condition, and this is the hope, is that while we're prone to error, which is the default mode, which is to stay in that anxiety state of mind, in that sympathetic state of mind where we're now hyper vigilant and worried, or we're hyper intensifying on something in the world to make us feel better when it's not. It's keeping us from connection. But we also have resilient, which is we have the ability to be resilient. And so the way when I studied for prevention strategy, I wanted to understand the nature of addiction and recovery and how faith worked with all of that. And what I've learned is that the brain believes everything it sees. and it responds to it as if it's true. And so that's the vulnerability. So some people who have a precondition for addiction, they might latch on to a substance which taps the reward system of the brain, that short-term feel-good reward system, and it keeps them thinking that that's what they need to feel okay. So they're moving away, they're in a default mode, they're moving away from empowerment, not towards it. And so the prefrontal cortex is not allowed to fully operate. Their system is flooded now. And this is true with devices as well. The creators of devices and apps for devices have studied that, how the brain works. And so they trigger the experience that a person goes through. It has the same, it taps the same reward system of the brain that is associated with short-term feel-good hits, and they never sustain. And these external stimuli never sustain. They keep us in a state of cocooned dissatisfaction, seeking to get more, but never getting enough, right? And so that is my way of understanding idolatry, because in the world, things will convince us of things that aren't true. Experiences will happen. And then we put those at the top of our list, and we ignore God and connection with other people. Now, the good news is that the brain also responds to internal stimuli. And internal stimuli are thoughts that come from the mind of God. That's how I understand it. And recovery happens from addiction when a person learns to rely on their own powers of self-determination, which are God-given, and chooses to prioritize healthy relationships above the short-term feel-good stuff. And that's internal. You cannot make somebody want to do that. You can support them in the effort. You can keep encouraging them to go there. You can pray for them. But at the end of the day, it's their decision. This is the nature of free will. We're prone to error, but we also are resilient. And in a community, in a supporting community, a person can be encouraged to make that choice. But I think the most encouraging and exciting aspect of the science of the brain and addiction and recovery and faith is the somatic, the physical properties that thoughts have internally. We know that they have physical properties externally, and that they tap the reward system of the brain that makes us go into these feedback loops that go nowhere. But internally, the thoughts can actually, the thoughts that come from the mind of God, the promises of God, they go back to those pillars, those God's promise, the slide of God's promises is your power. Those are thoughts that can actually stimulate the parasympathetic part of the brain and restore a sense of balance and calm and help us to reprioritize. So the science, for example, of Dr. Catherine Leaf tells us that we can create new memories and build that capacity to be the captain of our own ship and not be at the mercy of what's happening in the world. So to not be conformed by the world, but to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's what the human condition is capable of doing. So those somatic thoughts that I'm thinking about are, I refer to them as the mind thoughts that come from the mind of God. Well, these are wisdom thoughts. And they're eternal thoughts. They bring about peace, they empower self and others, and they transcend religious dogma. So an example, like if we want to go back to those pillars of my heart, as defined by Scripture, as established by Scripture, love casts out fear, 1 John 4:18. Well, what that might look like today in the middle of a pandemic or a crisis with a child is that my feelings are not the facts unless I choose to agree with them. And that's something to contemplate. And that's where God will meet you in your mind to help you work that out, and then to walk it and contradict what's happening in the world that's scaring you, right? Confucius. So wisdom thoughts do not, they transcend religious dogma. So there's truth in Confucius, for example. I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. And it's in the doing that I understand. So a thought to apply that for today would be, I am a lifelong executive learner. I'm always learning how to become a better version of myself. So whatever happens in life, I'm going to use it to work for me, not against me, because I have that power in here. I believe it, because that's what my God says. And then the last one other example is, as a man thinketh, so is he. Psalm 23:7. In every circumstance or situation, I have the power to choose what to think and how to respond, especially if I don't like my choices. And how easily we can deceive ourselves into thinking that because we don't like the choices, that we don't have power. That's again, the default triggering again. So it's consequences of human error and free will plus love equal empowerment. We can always move toward empowerment because we have access to thoughts that come from the mind of God by faith, not by fear. That's how we counter the default. So at the core, you know, moving forward, before we get to the family culture and some of the tools that can help you really build that resilience and be more confident and apply your faith, we really have to go back and ask ourselves, what do you believe about your own power? For me, it was, the big question was, you know, is my power associated with being in control of what happens with my kids? That desire for control is a default mode of being. Control over other people and circumstances. And so the exercise that I encourage parents to think about doing, and I just don't have, I haven't built it in for this webinar. Maybe we do another mini workshop on this, but I'll give you the directions and then you can do it separately. And then I'm also going to send you a separate document to help guide you through this process. But I call it Love Cast Out Fear exercise. And you write down your greatest fear. What is troubling you the most? And maybe it's several things. And then against each one of those thoughts, the fear, here's the outcome, here's the thought, you write the opposite. Because love is radical. Love counters the default fear-based mode that keeps us feeling like we can't, that we're a victim, and torments. It's radical. So you have to go directly opposite. And then think about that. Which do you want, really? Because sometimes we deceive ourselves into thinking, I don't deserve it, so we don't want it. So we discount that desire to have something well above and beyond the circumstance that we're in, because we just don't think we deserve it, or we don't think it's possible. There's all kinds of tangled thinking that needs to be unwound through meditation and prayer, based on those pillars that I was telling you about. Whatever scripture resonates for you to empower you, you use it, you meditate on it. So with that backdrop, I want to transition into sharing with you a relational model of authority for parenting in the parent-child bond, and some elements of family culture. And they're intertwined in that the first foundation for a family culture is a belief in a worldview. Now, I've said earlier, we don't get to micromanage the beliefs of our children or other people, right? Because it's internal. It's an inside job. We're in charge of the internal thoughts. However, we can have a shared belief that empowers, that encourages. And so I'm going to talk to you about what that looks like for kids and parents to restore the parent-child bond, the balance, the power balance there. And then I'll talk about some tips for making house rules to reinforce individual accountability and forgiveness and grace. So we get out of that crime and punishment mentality. But I wanted to just share on this, reflect on this, this one slide here, that it's important to distinguish between expectations and your values. We can have an expectation that every single child can learn how to become a trustworthy person. And if your values, your family values, are anchored around 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4-8, that says, this is what it means to be a trustworthy person, a good citizen in the home. I'm kind, I'm compassionate, I pitch in, I'm honest, right? All of the things that make you a trustworthy person, that we can expect. But in terms of outcomes associated with careers and school performance and all of that, those need to come from the children. They just need to know that we expect them to be a trustworthy person, and then we congratulate them on their achievements or encourage them to do better when they're disappointed, because they very easily will interpret being accepted or belonging is associated with grades or some other outcome. That's an automatic default on their part. So that's just a little caution there that I like to throw in. I think it's important to throw in. But we're going to focus on worldview and house rules. So in order to really understand the worldview that's going to best serve the family from the parent and the child perspective, I studied the traditional models of parent authority to really get a handle on it, because in my journey, I really struggled with, okay, well, how are we supposed to deal with this free will thing, right, and the devices? And I looked at all of the different theories that were out there. There's the first column deals with the perceived power base. The second column deals with attachment style, like secure, insecure, that type of thing. And then the discipline style. And number 2 is, and they all kind of lined up, they form these patterns. And typically the perceived power base in all of these models is that the parent has the seat of authority, in which I don't completely agree with, but the authoritative model is more confident in that there's an acknowledgement that the child has to learn how to be in charge of himself. And then there's secure attachment involved with that, and then there's pro-social discipline. And so this is all really very helpful if we can aim for that number 2 alignment of being authoritative, promoting a secure attachment, and being pro-social in our discipline, which is to be firm and kind. You have rules, you have consequences, but you don't enforce consequences with anger, that type of thing. You have confidence in your kids to learn. But what these models of authority, what they didn't deal with is what we're dealing with today with the advent of the phone in the hands of kids and this pandemic. It's hyped anxiety. The level of anxiety is very intense today. And so I developed a model of authority that I call a relational model of authority. And it's based on my study of faith, of wisdom, of the eternal thoughts that bring about peace and empower, in understanding the human condition as prone to addiction, but also resilient by faith. We're prone to fear, default, but we're also resilient by faith. And I studied how pedophiles and commercial interest engaged youth so that they could exploit them. And I did this and created a profile so that parents could engage youth and empower them. And so there's 2 components to this relational model of authority, which is really Jesus's example to meet people where they're at, no matter what their emotional state. Speak truth with mercy, show the way, and then you step back and you let that person choose. And you trust God with the choices, with the outcomes. And you just never give up hope, and you never give up faith, right? So there are 2 profiles, or 2 components. One is the social profile, which I call the digital native profile. And the other one is the profile of the inner self, the powers of the inner self, which are adult faculties, which everybody has. So we'll get into that. But the digital native is basically, the main thing is that they do not perceive authority as hierarchy or formal title. It's more of an experience of a relational experience of getting God, to be able to share what's happening and not be judged. And it's counterintuitive for a lot of parenting models, a lot of our parenting styles. It's a challenge because it's all learned behavior passed on from generation to generation. So God is teaching us something new. Cyber-powered friend communities can become a single point of reference for life. So this is a major concern. But we can counter it when we engage them and empower them, so that we give them other points of reference so they can seek wise counsel at home. Texting and social media is a main artery of communication. This is their world. They don't get to choose not to participate unless they want to be alone and isolated. And so we have to show them how to do it responsibly, and that's a whole nother talk. Seeking authenticity, they're looking for vulnerability, to admit that we're not perfect, and that, maybe sometimes we go offline and we're in our default mode, and to apologize when we're wrong, but also to hold the line when we're right and still do it in a way that doesn't condemn them, right? So that authenticity. Attention is scarcity. It's a premium. And we're giving all kinds of divided attention to each other. So undivided attention is precious. It's more precious than gold. And then trust is the currency. And there's a confusion about that. We tend to confuse trust and faith. Faith we reserve for God because it requires no proof. Trust among people is always verifiable. So we say to our kids, I trust that you're having age-appropriate experiences, and that you're doing, for the most part, you're making really good decisions. You're going to catch them doing things right, but you also need to be involved in their business. So that doesn't mean that you grant them privacy, because that would be leaving them vulnerable and without access to your wisdom. So our job is to provide protective cover that way, to advise and guide, to know what's going on. Now, the other aspect of this relational model of authority, so you have that social profile, how to engage. Once you engage, you want to empower. And the way we empower is by acknowledging that they are a fellow human being with the same powers of the soul as an adult, having a human experience. They know it instinctively. And so it's really important to think of it this way. The memory and intellect and will are the faculties that operate in the mind through the spirit. And the memory is like the brain acting as a video recorder, taking everything in. Remember that Human Condition 101 slide. It's responding to everything, internal and external stimuli. It's responding to both. It's just taking it all in. The intellect is the executive capacity to reason the truth about who we are in these life experiences. And the will is to choose what to believe. So you have fear-based thoughts, you have wisdom-based thoughts. Which do you want to believe, right? So that's what we're aiming to do, is to hold every thought captive to Christ, and captive and obedient to Christ, to pursue what the mind of God is telling us, and so that we can counter the default mode that's keeping us in a powerless state. And so the question becomes, do you, and really one more point about that is that even though our kids don't have a fully developed prefrontal cortex, they do have one. And the only way it's going to grow is if we help them to engage, to understand, to experience that is possible. And so the liberty, this comes back to the core teaching of core connectivity, is that we already have liberty. It belongs to the soul, and it can never be taken, but it's easily surrendered to the bully, the drug, or the device. So our job is to help our children keep their power, not to surrender their power to the wrong things. And that is our goal. But the question becomes, do you believe this is true? And that's where grace comes in, when you pray about it and you meditate on the promises of God, that his promise, his word is good, his word stands, that we have been given everything we need to succeed. So now we have to act on that truth. And despite how the feelings of fear are telling us, no, it's not true. And so a family creed is going back to the elements of family culture that would look something like this. It's basically a foundational belief. It's a universal truth, because you're not trying to micromanage your child's belief about God. God will introduce himself to our children through their own life experiences and through the input that we offer, if we're willing to be used that way. So this is one recommendation for how to begin that foundation. If you're going with that mustard seed of faith that makes a free society possible, right? This is true for people of all creeds, all generations, all genders, all social backgrounds, because of what Jesus did on the cross. Every individual has an inherent spirit of power and love and sound mind. 2 Timothy 1:7 tells us that. And can be expected to take responsibility for their own thoughts and actions. Is this true for you and your family? Is that the fundamental premise? And then the add-on to that is that each person is responsible for their own happiness. We cannot make other people happy. We can only make ourselves happy by the thoughts that we choose, and to take responsibility for what we have done, and learn and grow from it. So that's the premise of a fresh start family culture. And I wanted to share with you along those lines of how to put this into action. Imparting wisdom is a lot like downloading an app. If you think about it, everything is permissioned. And just like, when I gave you that, I showed you that slide of the closed spirit, the belief of a closed spirit of a child. We can close and open our spirits. We're in charge of that. To open your mind is to open your spirit to receive input. And so because love casts out fear, if we get anything that is going to hurt the soul, we immediately will shut down. And so when we impart wisdom, it is really a sacred experience of communication, open communication. So it's like downloading an app. First, you ask your child what is happening or what has happened, right? It's the Jesus model. You meet them where they're at, and they're having a human experience. We don't have to like it. It can scare the heck out of us. It doesn't really matter if you have a child that's suffering from bullying because she sent a nude photo of herself to somebody. That's her human experience. She can recover from that. She can grow from that. You have to, that comes back to, what do you believe about power, right? Then you repeat what you heard her say without editorializing, without offering your comments. And the reason why you want to repeat it is so that they can know that you heard what they said, that you're not trying to manipulate them and to judge them. And then after you've validated that, okay, this is what's happening, this is their perspective, then you ask, what would they like to know? Would they like to know what you know about it that might help? And this is your opportunity to build them up. This is your opportunity to go back to those wisdom thoughts, those pillars of scripture and other wisdom thoughts that you know are true, and share them with your child. You have been given everything you need to succeed. You are not what's happened to you. Your behavior does not define you. You define you. You have a spirit of power and love and sound mind. That's who you are. You are my magnificent daughter, my magnificent son. Regardless of what's happening, you stand up for the truth about where their power is. Because if they're having a default reaction to an external experience, you need to help them go the other way, right? To move toward the light, to be with you in that moment and be at peace and say, this happened, but it's not the end of the world and it doesn't define you. But you can't fake that. You really have to meditate and agree with God, and then God's grace waters that conversation. And I just wanted to give you an example with my older son when he was 7. He had injured himself because he sat underneath a shopping cart with his baby brother, was an infant seat in there, and that was full. He had been shopping with his dad, and his dad had warned him not to get down there because he was going to hurt himself. And sure enough, the cart full of groceries, and the baby rolled over his thumb, and he didn't make a peep. My husband said, well, he felt something, but he didn't realize that it was his thumb. But the child never made a peep. And later that day, I wasn't at the supermarket, not knowing what had happened. I wound up taking him to the doctor to aspirate because the thumb, because it was so inflamed. It was so painful. He went through so much pain. We had to put a needle in it to drain it. And then later that night, I was in bed. It was 11 o'clock, and something came over me. I said, I cannot go to sleep and not know, because my son never admitted what happened. He said, I don't know what happened. He kept saying, I don't know, because he didn't want to confess to his dad that his dad was right. He was feared judgment. So I went to his room, and I, at that point, didn't know what happened. And I was terrified that he could have this much pain and still not say what happened. How could he not know? He knew what happened, and he's withholding it from me. So I woke him up, and I was crying. I said, I cannot help you. I was vulnerable to him. I cannot help you, my 7-year-old. I cannot help you be safe if I do not know what has happened to you to cause you this kind of pain. I need to know if you are not safe. And then he burst out crying, saying, Dad told me not to, and I did anyway. And he feared retribution from his dad. He feared judgment from his dad. So I woke up his dad, and we talked about it, and he got consoled. But my reason for sharing this is that what if I hadn't pursued that? What if I hadn't been vulnerable and said, tell me, it matters to me that you're safe? Would he have believed that his dad could never forgive him for something like that? He wouldn't have experienced that exchange of forgiveness, and to not be condemned, but to go through that experience with love and support. And next time, and that's okay. But he was living with judgment, and that would have reflected on his relationship with his dad. So it's very important that we are vulnerable and are honest about our motive for what we want to know about what's going on in our kids' lives. And along those lines, when we look at house rules, I'm just going to quickly go through this because there's so many tips, and we could do a whole nother workshop on that for anybody that's interested. But the goal is to just have a few rules that foster open communication. You want to promote transparency, you want to build trust, and you want to offer a clean slate, which is another way of saying forgiveness, which I understand is correction, like aim this way, without condemnation, no judgment, no being outcast. So here's some example. So this is the process that we go through. We ask you to make a list of all the rules that you think are necessary. And then you narrow it down. You write them down, and then you list the concern or the interest and the benefit to the child and to the greater good, but especially for the child. And oftentimes what you find is that mostly many of the rules are a desire to be in control. And we think, oh, if I have the rules, that's going to be controlling. And the reality is that kids are in charge of themselves, and they can choose to follow rules or not. But what you want is open dialogue. So you want to have few rules. You want open dialogue about what's happening in life. So you want few rules with open conversation about what's happening, especially shame-inspiring things, or like in the case of my older son, who feared that his dad was going to judge him and be displeased with him because he got hurt doing something his dad warned him not to do. So it's easier to just have very few rules because they're easier to enforce. And if you have a lot of rules and you don't enforce them all, then you lose credibility. So here's an example of house rules that empower having a place for the devices to go at bedtime. And it's going to be age appropriate, and it's going to be depending on the circumstance. During the pandemic, you have kids at home. They're all doing different activities. They might need to collaborate online for projects. So you do your best to adapt, but the idea is that there is a lights out time. And you list the benefits and maybe a consequence. And downloading apps. This is something we recommend, is to have a family approved app list. And the concept is that you don't download apps just because they're free. It's not about how much money you pay for them. It's about what it's going to cost you in terms of personal security and peace of mind. So it's important to discuss it. And so your promise to your kids is that you will keep an open mind, and you will evaluate it with them, and then you will have the password, and then there will be open discussion about how the apps are working, whether it's gaming, whether it's a browser, whatever it is, whether it's social media, that you're learning together on how it works for you. You want to make it work for you. And then attention is your power. This is one of the things, going back to this idea that the brain is responding to internal, external stimuli. We have very strong external stimuli going on right now. We've got the devices, we've got pandemic news happening. We are living in an extremely high anxiety world, and it can be very distracting. And so we want to make sure that we do what we can to move away from the default mode and redirect that energy to an empowerment mode. So giving undivided attention with your children is so powerful, and it is so needed and so appreciated. And, you know, form agreements, you know, have your children take responsibility again for making their own schedules and what they want to do. Maybe they have some goals while they're in the shelter in place. They might have shelter in place goals. What do I want to work on? What do I want to accomplish? Finding some other activities. But I think the most important way that we can help empower our children to come to us and to feel more secure in talking and keeping that dialogue going is to give them permission to interrupt. And we use this peace sign, but there maybe it's a piece of paper, maybe it's a Post-it note of a certain color that you put down, that your child can put down, so that if you're in the middle of a Zoom conference, they're not showing up behind you, but maybe just, and then they know, you know, you can give a sign that says, I know you need to talk, I'm going to come right back at you. And so they can be patient. But the idea is that they have permission, and that you will give them proper attention as soon as you can wind it down. So they're giving you respect, that you have things that you need to do. And then you're also respecting their need to have undivided attention over something. And you do it with, you know, respect to them. For example, you don't just say, oh, what now, right? So and over time, you begin to refine that process. And so in the pandemic, some good things, for me, I just try to say, what good things can I do today? I mean, even if I can just say at the end of the day, I did one good thing, because sometimes we don't get to control all the things that happen. But to prepare yourself to be more in that empowered mode, make a list of the things that you admire about each child, because our children are magnificent blessings. And you want to catch them doing things right and let them know about it. They need that positive reinforcement. And you can create a family schedule, invite your kids to participate, maybe find a time when everybody can get together, even if maybe it's for lunch or what have you, just to download and share what's happening. And also maybe to initiate conversations about what you know, about what you're hearing, so that you all stay informed about what's going on with the pandemic. Because we're all learning how to get through this together, including, you know, China, who doesn't have, you know, much experience with transparency. It's all learning. We're all learning how to know and do better. Identify your greatest fears and also your greatest hopes. I think to be mindful of that, so that you can hold every thought captive to Christ and obedient to Christ, who knows and brings in the thoughts that come from the mind of God. Those wisdom thoughts that empower us to calm and steady, to be in a learning state. And then just make time to meditate. even if it's 5-10 minutes a day, and so that you can give mental energy to your hopeful thoughts. And in this way, you can retrain your brain, and you can grow the prefrontal cortex can grow stronger, and the amygdala, the sympathetic nervous system, can continue to operate, but it won't dominate. We want to be driven by faith, not by fear. And then just some of the resources. We're coming around 1 o'clock, and then I'll be able to open up for some questions, because I went through this quickly because I'd like to be able to have some dialogue with you if you were able to stay till 1:30. So enrichment resources, I do have this Fresh Start Manual. It's available on Amazon. It goes through 7 lessons on what it means to be in this hyper-powered world, hyping fear, and how do we interpret it ourselves. So there's a lot of questions and discussion questions, and to get you thinking more proactively and less in that default mode. There's 4 exercises to do an inventory of your family culture, exercises on how to create house rules, and a cyber rites of passage, different levels of autonomy with devices. And then another enrichment resource is a smaller book that I created. It's based on insights about love and suffering in the family. And the way I like to think of it is that Fresh Start Manual that I just showed you, those are the things that you do have some control over. How to govern the home, how to govern yourself, and then you govern the home, and you set up parameters, right? And then your child has to decide how they want to behave. Here is dealing with the stuff that you have no control over, which is somebody else's behavior. So this is all about forgiveness and grace and the empowerment that brings into healing somebody who's, if you look at behavior issues as suffering. And let's see, and then I do work with families privately. And so you can ask me about any kind of packages, or if you have a specific concern that you're dealing with, I can work with you to create a service for that. Whoops. And I also do workshops, and I work with professionals to train them to bring this into their practice, these tools and this thinking into their practice. And then I just want to remind you to go ahead, if you would please, in the next day or so, if not right after this webinar, just complete this survey. It's very simple. There's 4 questions. It'll take you less than 3 minutes. It's very simple answers, and the feedback really does mean a lot to me.